So after a long hiring search with more than 400 applicants, we found a shining star to take us into our next decade. So I am delighted to introduce you today to our new Executive Director of Planetary Health Alliance and Johns Hopkins Institute for Planetary Health, Dr. Rachel Marcus. Please join me in welcoming her to her new role. So.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here. I'm honored to follow in Marie's footsteps. You leave very big shoes to fill, and we're glad you're not going too far. I'm really just here to say hello so you know who I am. I see some old friends in the audience, but I'm really looking forward to meeting everyone, so please come up this week and say hello. I think I've been on board for a whole 4 weeks, so this is nicely timed so that I can really get to meet everybody. And with that, we are both really excited to introduce to you this next panel for the 10th anniversary panel. In particular, our moderator, Dr. Judith Rodin, who is a pioneer, innovator, and global thought leader, having led and transformed 2 institutions, the Rockefeller Foundation and the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Rodin has served as a member of the board for leading corporations and nonprofits, and currently co-chairs the National Academy of Medicine's Grand Challenge on Climate Change, Human Health, and Equity. She has authored numerous scientific articles and books,
And Dr. Rodin has been at the cutting edge of planetary health as a thought leader, funder, and champion of the field and movement. And in fact, she's been that thought leader and champion since before there was a term called planetary health. She continues to be a stalwart advocate of this work, for which we are most grateful. Welcome, Dr. Rodin.
Well, thank you for that extremely generous, overly generous introduction. I am delighted to be here. Rotterdam has a special place in my heart. It was one of our 100 resilient cities in the work that we did at Rockefeller, and we learned so much from the Dutch about the concept of resilience, and from the city of Rotterdam, so much. I'm delighted to kick off this well-deserved celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission on Planetary Health report, which was published in 2015. Marie and Sam asked me to remind this audience how it all began as we celebrate the extraordinary work of the last 10 years, and more importantly, as we plan for the future. When I was selected to lead the Rockefeller Foundation, the trustees were correctly focused on our upcoming centennial in 2013. They asked such questions as, where were the big ideas now? Where were the greatest global challenges? Where could Rockefeller really make a difference? And where could we mobilize coalitions and partners? What initiatives could have outsized impact on the future? A big aspiration, surely, but a truly exciting opportunity, and one that was very important. In our centennial planning, we focused in part on celebrating the major areas where Rockefeller had had significant impact over the prior century. And none had been more exciting, more important than our work in health, supporting groundbreaking biomedical research and training, and essentially creating and funding the field of public health. We were invited by the Chinese government to hold that celebration in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. Rockefeller Foundation brought Western medicine to China with the creation of the Peking Union Medical College, which still stands today and has trained thousands of doctors. From there, we launched what was called the Barefoot Doctors Program by the local people. It sent highly trained doctors out into the most rural, the most remote villages in China, saving hundreds of thousands of lives and bringing public health to China. Using that amazing history as prelude, I challenged the conference attendees to imagine the next 100 years of public health, what it could look like, and what our ambitions should be for what it might achieve. I hoped they would really think big, and I assured them that Rockefeller was willing to take risks. It was during the ensuing discussion that Richard Horton proposed the concept of planetary health, and literally I jumped out of my seat. That was the kind of big idea I was hoping for. To my delight, the conferees embraced the notion that in the next decades, it would be critical to do work that aligned human health and well-being with the health of natural systems, of all animals and with the planet. They concluded that this kind of approach required very bold and quite systemic transformation, with new kinds of research collaborations among basic researchers in climate science, veterinary medicine, biology, and of course, human health. This was to be Public Health 2.0. To support such a big idea, we began funding multiple lines of research that would define the breadth of this concept and would foster really broad transdisciplinary research and collaboration. Only 2 years later, in 2015, which is hardly an eye blink in research results time, the Lancet report hit the stand, so to speak, and a movement was launched. But I could never have imagined then that only 10 years later, there would be a consortium of over 250 partners, all of you committed to understanding and addressing the health impacts of global environmental change with as broad a focus on research, education, policy, and communication. Or that the next wave of growth would take the field to new geographies all over the world and bring indigenous peoples' knowledge and perspectives to the table. Our panel this morning will explore that growth. Each panelist in turn will tell the planetary health and development story from where he or she is located, both geographically and in approach, and describe briefly the exciting work that he or she does. To begin the conversation, I am delighted to introduce our first panelist, Andy Haines. Sir Andy Haines is the Professor of Environmental Change and Public Health at the Center for Climate Change and Planetary Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He was its director between 2001 and 2010. His work treating vulnerable populations in low-income settings, making the link between environmental change and ill health, has influenced the extraordinary trajectory of his career. He served on more international panels than I can name, including chairing the Rockefeller Lancet Commission on Planetary Health in 2014 and 15. And he continues to be internationally active and well sought after in this field. Andy?
Well, thanks so much, Judy, for that very kind introduction. And I think I can speak for all of us to say that we only wish that more heads of foundations had the same vision and tenacity that you have shown. And thank you again for funding, for making it possible for the Planetary Health Commission to undertake its work. So I want to reflect briefly on the legacy of the Commission and where things have got to in the last 10 years. And I want to focus really on three broad issues. These are challenges that the Planetary Health Commission threw out in its report. The first of these was imagination, or conceptual challenges. Do we really have the right framing to understand human progress? Many of the policies that we have at the moment, are they leading us astray, leading us in the wrong direction? I'll come back to that in a moment. The second is knowledge, evidence. Do we have the right kind of evidence to both understand the impacts of complex environmental changes on human health, on animal health, on plants and ecosystems? Or is our evidence too narrow in that focus? And importantly, do we have the right evidence to act in the right way? And finally, the implementation challenge, because sometimes when we know what to do, we're still not doing it. And there are very good reasons or very bad reasons for that, many of them related to current power structures and economic incentives. This slide is, I won't read it out in detail, but it's an attempt to summarize many of the interrelationships between climate change and human health, obviously just one of the planetary boundaries. And I think it's fair to say that the knowledge of how climate change affects human health has grown immensely in the last 10 years. There are still important gaps, of course, but there are many impacts that we do understand, ranging from the most direct, extreme heat, for example, through to the less direct effects on air quality, water quality, undernutrition, a whole range of infectious diseases, and also very importantly on the social determinants of health, migration, conflict, poverty, and so on. And this important implications of this, of course, for climate justice and for inequalities, because we know that many of these changes are increasing inequities, health inequities and environmental and economic inequities. What I think has been one of the more significant developments in knowledge generation and evidence is attribution science. So it's true to say that of all the thousands of papers about climate change and health, and indeed about planetary health more generally, many of them have actually failed to make specific attributional link. So they've talked in general terms about how changes in climate can affect human health, obviously true. But they haven't actually in a concrete way quantified the contribution of human-induced climate change as distinct from natural variability. Only about 20 papers. Well, that situation is now changing, and it's going to be a game changer, because what climate change litigation needs is good evidence of attribution. And that's why some of these cases have failed, litigation cases, because they haven't used the best available scientific evidence. And this, I won't read out the details of this study, but it's an early example of attribution science, which shows about over a third of the total heat deaths from these 43 countries from a few decades can be attributed to human-induced climate change. And as we've already heard, the most recent data from Europe suggests an even higher proportion of deaths. So the science is moving quickly, it will be crucial, and we need to extend that attribution science to other elements, to the other planetary boundaries as well, and also look at the interaction between the planetary boundaries, which again has been rather neglected. But it's also important to create evidence around how we react, and we have to react in two ways. Adapting to climate change that we can't prevent, or environmental change more generally, and then mitigating, cutting emissions, cutting the other drivers that are transgressing the planetary boundaries. And what we do know now is that there are big benefits, big near-term benefits from moving towards a more sustainable and clean economy. Over 5 million deaths, we estimated, caused by air pollution from fossil fuel burning. So they could be essentially prevented if we move towards clean, renewable energy. Millions of deaths due to physical inactivity. And the only practical way, really, of getting people walking and physically active is through sustainable transport, walking, cycling, public transport. And then we've just heard 2 days ago from the Eat Lancet Commission, they've increased their estimates. It's now 15 million deaths annually could potentially be prevented by shifting towards healthier diets. And of course, it's the food system which is driving not just climate change, 25–30% of greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, freshwater pollution, and many of the other changes that we're seeing. And remember that 7 of the planetary boundaries have now been transgressed, including ocean acidification in the last few days, as we've heard. So there's big opportunities, big gains to be had from mitigating climate change, mitigating other planetary level changes. As I've said, we have to both adapt and mitigate. And one of the problems we have is that the adaptation community is often very divorced from the mitigation community. They work in different silos. And this is still a problem of planetary health. People are still working in their comfort zones, in their narrow spaces. And what we need to do, of course, is to collaborate across disciplines and across actions, because we need to adapt and mitigate at the same time. If you don't integrate adaptation and mitigation, you can get maladaptation, where things are actually made worse. If you put air conditioning everywhere, for example, then you increase the urban heat island, you increase energy demands, you increase air pollution, and so on. And nature-based solutions, and I don't always like the term nature-based solutions, who are these solutions for? But anyway, we'll gloss over that. But nature-based solutions can integrate adaptation and mitigation. So we need to really emphasize the need for coherent and integrated policies. And you can see that there's a long way to go in terms of healthcare adaptation, adaptation more generally. Now, moving on towards some of the conceptual challenges, one of the things we didn't really envisage, I think, in the Lancet Commission was the rise of militarism. At that time, it looked like expenditure, and you can see in the charts how expenditure in 2015 actually was dipping. It looked like it was going down. The number of conflicts was going down. You can see it on the right side of the chart. But actually, subsequently, it's gone up. And now I would suggest that militarism is one of the big challenges to planetary health, not just because it's responsible for vast environmental damage, 55% of greenhouse gas emissions, much other environmental damage, but also because it's sucking resources out of the planetary health agenda. $2.7 trillion being spent on arms to kill people. It doesn't really enhance our security. In fact, it undermines it. And so we need to reframe security, not as competing with our so-called enemies or adversaries, but actually tackling the planetary health agenda. And that will bring true security. So we need to reframe that and counter this, I think, very risky march to war, not just conventional weapons, but also nuclear weapons, which, as we know, pose a very significant threat to planetary health. So in concluding, let me just make a few final remarks about how we need to move forward. How can research contribute to the kind of transformational change that we need in order to address the planetary health challenges that we are beginning to understand much better? We often think about tipping points as negative things, tipping points in the Earth systems which can lead us towards disaster, but there could also be positive tipping points. And this illustration is taken from a paper by Ilona Otto, who's a social scientist from Austria. And she proposed that we needed to identify key tipping points for rapid social change. We need to understand the opportunities and benefits of change, and we need to really foreground those because we know that public opinion often responds much better to a positive message about opportunities than a negative message saying we're all going to hell and there's nothing we can do about it, because it's not true. So increasingly, we need to focus on evaluation. Many of the policies that have been shown to benefit human health, much of that's based on mathematical models. They're very important, but they don't tell us what happens when you try to implement those policies. And so we need to now to engage in a major agenda of evaluation to catalyze the uptake of effective policies, technologies, and interventions. If we're lucky, we may get that smooth transition to a planetary health state. But most probably, we're going to go along that pathway at the bottom there. It's going to be really turbulent, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing turbulence, and I would argue that one of the reasons that we're seeing so much science denial at the moment is because we have been successful. We've shown that actually many of these trends are disastrous for humanity. So what do? If you have all your investments in fossil fuels, you've got to lie. It's the only way forward. And so that's what they're doing, sadly. So now we wouldn't pick a fight, but if a fight is coming, then we have to know which side we're on. So there will be a lot of turbulence, and we shouldn't be discouraged necessarily by pushback, because that's inevitable if you're making the right kind of noises and having the right kind of impacts. So finally, what needs to change to transform the system? Well, power relationships for sure, because what we're seeing is now the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. So economic growth is not about benefiting the majority. If it was, it would be a different matter. But it's not. It's about concentrating wealth in fewer and fewer hands in many economies. And so we have to call that out. We have to understand system structures, because actions and interventions can't just be single interventions. They actually have to look systemically at the system which is driving us to disaster. Technologies are important. We've seen that with solar energy. The cost of solar energy has come down by 99%, and that is driving the solar transition in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. But technologies will not be sufficient. They're necessary, but not sufficient. We also need to change knowledge structures. Values, I would argue, extremely important, because if our values are all tied up with consumerism, then we're doomed to failure. And obviously, we need to appreciate different knowledge systems. We've already heard about the importance of indigenous knowledge, which I think captures much better than traditional Western knowledge the importance of this interplay between the health of human populations and the health of the natural systems in which we live. So I just leave you with that thought that our future evidence and future implementation challenges have to relate to transformation. which means that we in public health have to work with a range of different disciplines, social sciences, ranging from anthropology to more mathematical sciences. We need to work with our colleagues in different indigenous groups. We need to understand the importance of reducing inequities, and we need to counter mis- and disinformation and challenge powerful interests that are driving us towards a potentially destructive future. But there are a lot of opportunities, and that's what we have to emphasize going forward. Thank you so much.
I know that's already stimulated a lot of questions, so get your questions organized. We'll take them all after all the panelists. I'd like to introduce now Nicole Redvers, who's a member of the Deninu First Nation, Northwestern Territory, Canada tribes, and has worked with various Indigenous patients, various Indigenous communities around the globe to help bridge the gap between traditional and Western medical systems. She's an associate professor, Western Research Chair, and director of Indigenous Planetary Health at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Western Ontario. Nicole?
Masicho, thank you for that warm welcome, and really happy and honored to be here on a really reflective time for me, 10 years in terms of it. And I was thinking back yesterday in my realm of jet lag, and imagining back when I was a little girl. And I remember hearing stories from elders, and I've shared this in some places before, where my elder's grandfather, when she was young, back in the late 40s, early 50s, telling of stories about when she was old, it was going to be a time when sickness would start waking up from the ground, when lakes would start collapsing in themselves, and when the Earth's axis would start to shift. And that would be a time of great change. And of course, in my region, in the subarctic region of Canada, we're now seeing the permafrost melt, which is allowing for our lakes to start collapsing. One day they're there, and one day they're not. They're just completely absorbed in the ground. We've seen, of course, sickness being mobilized in the permafrost, particularly in areas in the circumpolar world and infecting families. We've also seen NASA confirm the axis shift in the Earth's plane due to the high extraction of fresh water around the globe, as well as the melting poles creating a weight distribution on the planet. Our elders 40, 50 years ago were talking about how the stars were shifting in the sky. They weren't in the same place anymore, that they were starting to see changes in the environment. And they put out warning signs, but they were not listened to because they were Indigenous elders. They didn't have this science background accustomed to academic places. And despite those decades, what often happens within scientific circles in many areas, of course, is once the first scientist determines that there's a problem, they put their name on a paper and they're the expert within that area. So when I first heard this term, planetary health, it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago. I did a search and I found one paper that was referencing Indigenous peoples as part of that process. Yet at the same time, you know, we had terms like Denechanya, like Natse J2, in our communities that talked about Mother Earth's health and well-being, that talked about water healing, not in the concept of a static identity of health or a state of health, but of a dynamic balance of a process of a flux of healing that was always in place within our communities. And the interdependence that was required was our responsibility for stewardship, for reciprocity with the lands that we came from, natural laws, rules, and places that demanded a certain relationship of values between ourselves and the planet to ensure our survival, not only as humans, but as the animals. I was listening this morning, and in our region, we often look at the height of the beaver dams as well as where the bees make their hives, because we know where the water level is going to be that year in advance, because they tell us that. We've been learning from our animals, from our environment, through land-based learning and education for millennia. These kinds of knowledges are not new. So when I first heard about this concept, and I kept hearing people talk about it, planetary health, I just kept hearing my own elder stories of Mother Earth's health and well-being. I want to call out Dr. Susan Prescott. I don't know if she's here today, but she started an Aligning Planetary Health organization back probably a few years after the Lancet Commission perhaps started, and was really one to push back on the justice, the equity component, as well as the need for system-based change. And that was my first introduction in terms of an organizational structure to planetary health, and I really appreciated her openness to being accepting of Indigenous values, Indigenous worldviews, and Indigenous peoples at that point, and gave me a comfort, because the question always remains for Indigenous peoples within many of these scientific circles is not the inclusion, not the making space for, but do we belong? Do our voices matter? Because at the time, and still continuing today, there's a perpetuation of Euro-Western scientific dominance that tends to suppress on the histories of epistemicide, of the killing of knowledges through colonization, that still mobilizes in some ways today. However, we've seen, even in the conversations this morning, that the sense of belonging, the realization that we can't solve complex problems from the same worldview that created it in the first place, because it will continue to perpetuate a disconnect between ourselves and the planet as relatives, is becoming more understood. So as we move forward in terms of the advances, I've been really happy, and I think for many that have been in this space know that I have no problem speaking out when there's issues or when there's injustices, but have been really appreciative of the planetary health community being open and starting to increase the dialogue. And now today, seeing many more Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities represented not only here today at the conference, but in the academic literature and the discourse around this topic, including many papers that I was really happy to be a part of, outlining from our perspective, from an Indigenous perspective, collectively, individually, as nations, what we see that's needed for planetary health going forward. And with all of these things coming, the reflection, I think, begs itself, where do we go? And for many Indigenous peoples, we've already been through genocide. Ongoing, in some cases, as well as historical, but we're still here. And when I look at elders that have been through genocide, that have survived, that have been through systems that have tried to erase their knowledges, to try to assimilate them into your Western cultural values, they're still here and they're laughing, they're smiling, they're telling jokes. There's a resilience that's embedded in that, and a recognition that we don't give up for our mother. No, we would never do that. So this constant effort that's needed, despite that trajectory of up and down that Andy was talking about previously, is expected. We're going through cycles in the world right now, and my elders have told us in ceremony that the next 2 years is going to be tough. Brace, but don't stop doing the work that you're doing. It's important to keep your head up, keep laughing, keep our balance, because I've been seeing a lot of low energy lately, particularly in the North American environment, which is very relevant, of course. We're feeling the after effects in Canada very much. But at the same time, we put our heads down and we do the work. And sometimes we put our heads up and we do the work and we speak. Because throughout all the events that happen, at the top there, before colonization, the majority of our First Nations community in Canada were matriarchal. We had women leaders. That it was a legal mandate, a policy within the Canadian environment. It also happened in many of the colonized places, where men were the only ones that were allowed to lead. So it was embedded within political law and policy that only men were able to lead. So what that's created is the mess that we have today. So that respect for the feminine, the rematriation component, is incredibly important as we move forward in this work. This idea of recognition of our non-human relatives. We are just one very small part of a larger system. And this this we, cosmocentric worldview is absolutely integral. And I often challenge folks, that are working in this field, because even still today, we see, even despite our movement away from the human-centric, the anthropocentric, that many of the decisions that we make, many of the research questions that we're creating, are still based on a lack of fundamental values that see ourselves as one small part of a larger system. And how do we continually embed ourselves into Earth-centric value systems, into ensuring that biodiversity is acknowledged just as much as climate change, which tends to get a lot of focus within this space. But also how we see ourselves in our community relationships, because a lot of times ecological destruction is because we don't see ourselves as part of a greater system. And when you don't see yourself as part of a greater system, it makes it easier to project predatory impulses onto the environment. And this leads to planetary harm. These are things our elders have known and codified within our natural, our original laws, our original instructions that are very clearly embedded from childhood all the way up into our communities. This governance and law and the importance of it in how we frame not only our leadership considerations, but how collective consensus making is building within the key decisions that we need to make going forward. And then finally, highlighting the importance of Indigenous peoples' health as a key determinant of health. We know now that Indigenous peoples host, steward the majority of the remaining biodiversity on the planet, yet we make up only 6% of the global population. 6% of the global population is currently right now stewarding for each and every one of you the majority of the remaining biodiversity on the planet. So without Indigenous land rights, without Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, Indigenous peoples will not have their health and well-being and will not be able to continue stewarding the majority of the remaining biodiversity for each and every one of you. So for me, Planetary Health's most important facet is on Indigenous land and place rights, self-determination, cultural sovereignty, because we need those people to continue being on their lands, to continue perpetuating their knowledges within their communities in an intergenerational fashion, because they don't only do it for themselves, they do it for the earth, and they do it for the wider community. So I want to say Masicho and thank you for those Indigenous peoples that continue to stand up despite all of the things going on. They're one of the most persecuted groups with the highest amount of planetary violence for environmental defenders in the world, particularly in Latin and South America, as well as in Africa and Asia. And we're seeing higher and higher rates of people being murdered and killed. One of my good friends was killed last year for defending Mother Earth's rights as well. These are real and realities. They're on the front lines, and we need to do more to be able to support their efforts in all multitudes and forms. So with that, it's an honor to reflect on the last 10 years. I'm really grateful for all of the leadership and the people that conceptualized the term, because it allows us as Indigenous peoples to have a leverage point to bridge some of the knowledges that we've had for thousands of years into a modern environment and continue this conversation in a way, shape, and form that people can understand and appreciate, but most importantly, connecting to in the heart. We say as Indigenous peoples that yes, we have Indigenous sciences, but our sciences are connected to the heart. So Masicho, thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Nicole. and you can see from the warm response the appreciation of the thousands of years of Indigenous knowledge and how much we can continue really to learn from it. Our next speaker is Melvin Otieno, who is an environmental health scientist, early career researcher as well, from Kenya. She's the founder of Planetary Health Eastern Africa Hub and an associate member of Women Leaders for Planetary Health and has been a Planetary Health campus advisor. She holds a BSc in Environmental Biology and Health and a Master's in Environmental Health from the University of Eldoret, Kenya, and is currently pursuing her PhD in Global Health and Planetary Health at Martin Luther University in Halle-Wittenberg, Germany. Melvin?
Thank you so much, and it's really an honor to be here. I would like to read my speech, and then I'll welcome discussion later. So it is such an honor to be here at this historic moment, celebrating 10 years of planetary health as a field and as a movement. When we look back, we see how far we've come, building knowledge, awareness, and action. So, but when we look forward, we see that there is a strengthening of our movement, in inclusivity of bringing youth, women, and also regional voices in the center of planetary health. To me, planetary health really refers to the vital connection between human health and well-being and of our natural environment. So as a Kenya, I recognize that we are really faced with a number of climate change situations, from flooding, heat waves, and so on. And upholding planetary health really means taking responsibility to protect and restore environment or ecosystem, to sustain life, ensuring a resilient and sustainable future for our communities and our nation. So as the coordinator of Planetary Health Eastern Africa Hub of the Planetary Health Alliance, I've witnessed how much regional hubs are very important. And for us, we've been able to aim at community building, education for transformative action, and also supporting the youths in various activities, and also amplifying the policy issues. So we've worked to amplify these knowledge systems, community practices, and also encourage more South-South collaboration as well as North-South collaboration. So I'd like just to present to you one of our project called SOPHIA, Strengthening One Health and Planetary Health in Eastern Africa region, which we've been collaborating together with the University of Eldoret, Catholic University of Health and Allied Sciences, and University of Würzburg. So through this project, we've really invested much of our time in education, planetary health education, and under this, we've really worked really hard to come up with a planetary health education toolbox so that it enables universities across the region who are integrating planetary health into their curriculum to use it. So it has been a success, one of our successes through this project. And we see that universities are central to this. And imagine if planetary health principles were integrated into medicine, nursing, public health, agriculture, engineering, and even economics, how it will look like. So we would like graduate professionals who see health, environment, and also equity to be inseparable. So we have this powerful resource for you to use, and it's an open access platform to enable us to teach planetary health modules. So to amplify this, there is also need for doing more of summer school programs, and we see through our collaboration, we've had a number of summer school programs each year together with the University of Würzburg, where we enable young people to really share their case study project ideas and so on, and they have been really coming up with innovative project ideas that are really needed to be supported. And in line with that, we've also introduced our first summer school in East Africa early this year, where it was hosted at KUAS University, and we see that it really enabled the students at East Africa to really share perspective on these climate change situations and also on the topic of biodiversity and so on. And also we see that the Planetary Health Alliance has really played a key role in integrating Planetary Health Campus Ambassador program. And through this program, we've seen that it has really been a highlight for engaging the youth in these spaces to focus more on planetary health activities. This is just one example of regional activities that was held by one of the campus ambassadors in Tanzania, and he has been able to really push forward for the agenda together with the communities and also together with the student as well. Aside from that, we have also really been pushing forward for regional or conferences. So through the SOPHIA project, we've been really proactive. Each year we always have one health and planetary health conference in East Africa, where we share our research and so on. Aside from that, I would like also to share one of our major projects that we've involved or engaged the policymakers, that is public health operations for climate action, development of a framework to identify priorities operations. So through this project, we were able to benchmark Germany and Kenya and look into the WHO framework on prioritizing planetary health climate change issues. And it was a real honor for us to involve the Ministry of Health in these settings and also collaborating with other county government officials. Sorry. So to just conclude, I would like to say that as we look to the next decade, let us commit to three things: building pipelines for youth leadership, and also investing and expanding regional hubs, and also uplifting leaders, women leaders in planetary health. If we succeed, the next 10 years will not only be about advancing planetary health through knowledge, but also transforming societies and also ensuring planetary health is rooted to justice and inclusivity and community. So I would like to conclude by saying that Planetary Health began as a vision 10 years ago, and today it's a movement. Tomorrow it must become a way of life, and that this will be possible to empower the youth, uplift women, and also connect regional voices to shape a healthier and just and sustainable world for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Melvin. Our next panelist is Tatiana Camargo, who is a biologist and assistant professor who is both a researcher and teaches about scientific education in different contexts and for different public audiences, aiming to promote scientific literacy as a key tool for exercising key citizenship, something we heard a lot about already this morning. She's a member of the Brazilian Planetary Health Study Group, Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Sao Paulo, coordinates the Brazilian Planetary Health Ambassador Program, and is a Planetary Health Alliance Education Fellow. Tatiana co-authored the 2021 Lancet Countdown Policy Briefing for Brazil. Her work with Planetary Health is focused on gender equity and rural communities. Tatiana?
Yeah. I want to begin by thanking Planetary Health Alliance and the Planetary Health Annual Meeting 2025 organizers for the invitation and for the great opportunity of being here among such dear and distinguished colleagues. As Melvin, I wrote a text and I will read it to keep me in my 5 minutes time, okay? Today, I am here to share with you some of what I've learned and thought about planetary health over the last 10 years, from the perspective of a Latin American woman, biologist, and educator. And I have decided to present this in the form of a concise summary, which begins with 3 questions. What does planetary health mean for Latin America? What are the main challenges to be faced in its pursuit? And what is the main contribution that Latin America has to offer to the planetary health movement on an international scale? So, in an attempt to answer these 3 questions, I began with this planetary health boundaries diagram to highlight the most direct impacts that Latin America has been responsible for causing on the planet. I have circled them. Oh, I'm osed here because we will have a panel after about this planetary health diagram, but okay, yeah. I have circled them here in purple in the most recent version from 2025 of the planetary health boundaries diagram. You can see here biosphere integrity, CO2 concentration, land system change, geochemical flows, and novel entities. All of them are deeply connected to a colonial way of inhabiting this planet. For the ancestral peoples of our territory, Latin America, her original name was Abya. So Latin America, this name, this concept, was born out of this encounter with colonial habitation, which consumes natural systems and the bodies of the most vulnerable to exhaustion. Today, let me change. It's here? Yeah. Today, it remains heavily involved in international food systems, which drive a chain that extends from deforestation and forest fires to cattle farming, ultimately leading to monocultures of grains such as soybeans. So, from my point of view, our primary challenge in Latin America is to find ways to collaborate on achieving greater sustainability in food systems and promoting equity in an inseparable manner. Changing it again. Yeah. In my practice of this concept movement of planetary health, I am committed to education. Paulo Freire, the famous Brazilian popular educator, said that education alone does not transform society, but without it, society does not change either. So, in this sense, in order for us to drive the major transformations pointed out by the planetary health movement, it is essential that we dedicate ourselves to education of children and young people in the schools, of professionals from different areas in universities, and paying special attention to popular education that occurs in groups like that I show in the photos of women farmers and quilombola women. And I conclude here today inspired by the words of another Brazilian, Chico Mendes, a community leader and environmentalist who was murdered in the struggle to defend the Amazon forest, which I express here in my words. So, to Chico Mendes, an environmental movement that does not seek to confront inequity is gardening, beautiful but decorative. So may the inseparability of environmental justice and social justice continue to be the essence of planetary health, which mobilizes us to the challenge of implementation. Thank you, and muito obrigada.
Our last two speakers will be joining us virtually, so I'll ask you to watch the screen closely. Our first is Maisarah Faiesall, who's the head of policy, strategy, and advocacy for the Sunway Center for Planetary Health in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. She holds a master's in public policy and a first-class bachelor's degree in international relations and Mandarin. She currently leads the governance and business initiatives that are contributing to the implementation of the Planetary Health Roadmap and Action Plan, launched last year in the 2024 Planetary Health Annual Meeting at Sunway. Her focus is on building capacity and policies that prioritize well-being in development agencies. Maisarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Judith, for that kind introduction. I must apologize that I don't have slides, so you will have to bear with my giant face on the screen. But it's really such an honor to be part of this 10th anniversary celebration, especially from someone who's only known of planetary health and interacted with colleagues in this space for 4 years now. And I say only deliberately because it's felt like time just flew by so fast. But really, look at what this movement has become, and I'm so happy to be a part of it. But the past 4 years have really given me a lot of learnings, a lot of excitement and energy, but also a lot of reflections. And so within those reflections as well, I'd like to offer maybe a couple of reality checks, a candid look at who we are and where we stand today. And much of this is really owed to the people behind the movement. So I came into planetary health not from a clinical public health or academic track, but really from a policy advocacy standpoint and just a general standpoint of social justice, because to me, that's what it really is. Planetary health is a whole of society interdisciplinary space, and our community, I think, must continue to reflect that reality. So in the space of where I come from in Malaysia, and I could say for many of us in Southeast Asia, the people driving this movement are often not the usual suspects. And I mean not public health practitioners, not scientists or academics. In fact, the people that I engage with on a day-to-day basis are often urban planners, disaster responders, tech developers, economists, and jack of all trades, policymakers, and such. And of course, not to forget young people, youth. Youth are such a core of all of the work that we do at the Sunway Center for Planetary Health. And I can still recall in one of our youth programs, as part of an icebreaker, we had asked, what do you think of planetary health? Is it more of an environment issue or a health issue? Move to the right if you think environment, move to the left if you think it's health. It was meant as a trick question, but so imagine my very pleasant surprise to see that majority of the participants, the youth participants that we had, stayed in the middle and looked at me with kind of puzzled looks, in the sense of like, what do you mean? Isn't it both? Isn't it a systemic issue? And that was literally the response that I got. So it was just such a perfect illustration of, you know, where we're at, but also of the opportunities that we have ahead, especially with the younger generation. But my point is really that people from every walk of life, you know, who look at the world, see the systemic connections, and somehow in their own personal way resonated with the worldview that Planetary Health carries. They resonated with the thinking that we cannot be healthy on a sick planet, that everything's interconnected, or that nature does more than just give us what we need to produce our economies, and this old way of thinking no longer works. So that's the first reality check, that we must engage with people beyond our usual suspects. And so, you know, to the likes of the original authors and scientists and researchers, a big thank you, because you gave us the diagnosis, you gave us the language, and what planetary health is. But 10 years later, outside of this conference, outside of, you know, our usual spaces, the world might not just be waiting for another set of papers. And that really brings me to my second reality check. I think we must be really honest about the landscape that we're operating in right now. Outside of this conference, you know, geopolitical tensions are not a distraction. They're becoming the new context, the genocides, the conflicts that we see, the rise of nationalism and populism and great power competition. I think a lot of it was covered by Andy earlier. They're all demanding urgent political attention and competing with the resources that we have globally. And adding to this is what we're witnessing as a declining faith in rule of law, and especially international law. So from the perspective of a layman, you know, outside of our usual spaces, watching the news, when global norms, agreements, and shared structures of governance are routinely questioned and ignored, what we have, or what we look to have, is an environment of profound instability, and one that can potentially breed powerlessness. And what we desperately need is agency and courage in the face of crisis. So really the question for all of us in the global planetary health community is, what stories are we telling, and especially to the younger generation? So it's really not a surprise, you know, when the political bandwidth is stretched so thin, when societies are polarized, and when trust in science is weaponized, it's things like planetary health that is so rooted in long-term thinking that are the first things to be crowded out. And that explains why, you know, so many climate and health policies were the ones to be checked out in some countries, because more and more leaders are starting and are more compelled to focus inward, prioritizing short-term electoral wins, prioritizing short-term profits over long-term existential threats. So really, I would say that this short-termism, or this short-term thinking, may very well be the single greatest obstacle to a global long-term pursuit of planetary health. And if the last decade was about defining the problem, the next decade must be about disrupting the systems that are killing the planet. We must move from just an academic pursuit to an engine of systemic political action. And I would say that also our most urgent task now is policy agility. I think many of us here are conditioned to value rigor, peer review, and, you know, the usual 5-year grant cycles, rightfully so. But coming from a policy perspective, the planet is really moving at the speed of crisis. Policy, it's very rare for policy to wait for a 5-year study, and policy cannot wait for perfect data. The landscape is moving way faster than we can imagine. And if we miss the window or several windows, we miss the opportunities to save lives and entire ecosystems. So our community at this point, I think, is at the crossroads of needing to mobilize ourselves better, and also recognizing and acting on those policy windows, those brief, volatile moments where a crisis creates the necessary political will for radical change. And here I must share Malaysia's National Planetary Health Action Plan as an example in seizing such a window. It made it as far as it has now, which, by the way, is only in the final deliberation and publication stages, because one, there was a strong champion in Dr. Jamila Mahmood, who I'm sure is in the room somewhere today, who was willing to annoy everybody in 2020 and 2021 in pushing for planetary health. But also, secondly, because of the landscape when it happened. You know, it was at the height of COVID, it was at the height of the pandemic. So there was this direct, almost visceral link between zoonotic spillover, environmental destruction, and economic shutdown that was so visible and so easily understood by everybody. And so that crisis provided the political clarity to so many people that years of publications and pushing for a struggle. So, but now the world is sliding back to short-term thinking. So the question really is, where do we now strategically engage? Where can we tip the balance to favor coordination and interconnection rather than continued fragmentation? And I think this is why the role of the community, the people at the heart of planetary health, is more critical than ever. We must become the stabilizing force in an increasingly fragmented world. And this is precisely why we must also radically expand the global planetary health community to engage the non-usual suspects, all of the people that I've mentioned earlier, because now our objectives require their power, their budgets, and also their cultural reach. So we need economists, we need urban planners to take the well-being of people and planet into the center of development agendas. But we also need security thinkers and practitioners. As Andy also mentioned, militarism is such a huge threat, but engaging them is a direct link to political resources and so critical to addressing the growing risk of natural resource weaponization, especially in conflicts over water and land. But we also, on the flip side, need storytellers, filmmakers, digital artists, and it's all about shifting the narrative from the doom and gloom and guilt to one of urgent opportunity and possibilities, making the narrative so much more positive than what we often see in the news today. And at the bottom of it, we also need Indigenous leaders, we need faith-based communities to challenge, at the end of the day, the core values of extraction and really place stewardship back at the heart of decision-making. So maybe on that note, I really hope that the next decade goes beyond what and who we already know, but by the scale of our political impact. And for this, I think we really need a collective reimagination so that we can tip things positively on our side. And in short, I guess, to just say that we have much, much more work to do and so many more people to talk to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our final perspective comes from Michael Weatherhead, who co-founded the Wellbeing Economy Alliance 7 years ago. In his role as development lead, he leads the relationships with new and existing supporters of WEAll, supports the organization's focus on redefining the role of business, and develops and oversees new programs of work in the design of international economics architecture. Michael is an economist by training who first worked in agricultural trade economies in both the Caribbean and in Oxford. He was also the international director of the consulting arm of the New Economics Foundation, where he took the concept of well-being into organizations quite diverse as the UK's National Health Service, retailer John Lewis Partnership, and the apparel industry via Timberland. Michael?
Wonderful, thank you so much, and hello to everyone. I wish I could have been there with you in Rotterdam, but it looks like a wonderful venue. I won't take too much time because I know I'm the last one of the panelists and we want to get on to the conversation. But I just wanted to share a few thoughts in terms of our interaction with the Planetary Health Alliance from the perspective of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So the first interaction we had with Planetary Health Alliance was really being invited in onto a panel a few years ago to talk about nature and business. Now, I remember Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever, was talking about his nature positive business work. I was asked to talk about how businesses align to a well-being economy, and others were also asked about their work. Now, what really encouraged me by that invitation was the Alliance's desire to bring together those with a similar North Star, but perhaps that used different language or advocated for different pathways towards that shared North Star. I recognise the value in what the Alliance were doing with that panel because it is very much the role that WEAll plays in the economic systems change space. So the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or WEAll for short, is a collaboration of change makers around the world working together to transform the economic system. Now, our assumption, which I think is in many ways shared with the Alliance, the Planetary Health Alliance's assumptions about how change happens, is the following. So firstly, nothing ever changed without a movement demanding it and demonstrating for it. But a movement will never form without a compelling story that people want to be a part of. Also, ideas evolve and improve through sharing, listening, and learning. But ideas become actions through a variety of approaches that chip away at different points of the system. But we won't know in advance which approach finally cracks the old system. Therefore, we need a mosaic movement of different folk with different skills and different spheres of influence. So we work on three simultaneous fronts with our members and our partners, such as the Planetary Health Alliance, which we consider essential pillars for systemic transformation. Now, the first of these is strengthening, supporting, and connecting power bases, so existing geographic and thematic power bases at all levels of societies, and together have the power to change the current global economic system. Now, I was listening to all of the other speakers, and one comment that Nicole made about matriarchal societies in pre-colonial lands, I don't think it was any coincidence that the leaders of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, a pioneering group of governments that examine economic policy through the lens of well-being, were all women. The Prime Ministers of Iceland, Scotland, and New Zealand, Katrín Jakobsdóttir, Nicola Sturgeon, and Jacinda Ardern. Secondly, co-creating knowledge that demonstrates the viability of a wellbeing economy to influence change and set the agenda for governments and businesses at all levels to sequence just transitions. An area where we look to draw in the research and the work of partners such as the Planetary Health Alliance, as well as others in the movement, in order to synthesize and make them as accessible as possible for those decision makers willing to be brave enough to try something different. And then thirdly, changing cultural narratives about what's possible and desirable, so millions of people of all ages and from all walks of life are inspired to act at a local, national, and global level. Now, the poster over my shoulder here is a really good example of how we felt telling stories was the best thing that we could do at COP26 in Glasgow. We held a music festival, the Common Ground Fest. You may be able to see, I'm not sure whether you can. The strapline at the top is transform the economy to save the planet. And we mixed panels with musicians and storytellers and felt this was the way that we could lean into playing our role at COP26 rather than just going in and going for policy prescriptions, etc. So now I realize I've kept referring to something called a well-being economy without really defining what it is. So put simply, a well-being economy is an economy designed to serve people and planet, not the other way around. So rather than treating economic growth as an end in and of itself and pursuing it at all costs, a well-being economy puts our human and planetary needs at the center of its activities, ensuring that these needs are all equally met by default. So how do we know whether we've achieved the well-being economies around the world? Well, we have 5 key needs. Nature, we have a restored, safe and natural world for all life. Dignity, everyone has enough to live in comfort, safety and happiness. Fairness, so justice in all its dimensions at the heart of economic systems, and the gap between the rich and the poor is greatly reduced. Participation, not necessarily something that one thinks about when thinking about the economy, but citizens are actively engaged in their communities and locally rooted economies. And lastly, connection, a sense of belonging and institutions that genuinely serve the common good. Now, I'm not going to go into the types of policies that will look to support the achievement of those needs here. I don't think we have enough time. It may come out in the conversation going forward. But just looping back to the beginning and our first engagement with the Planetary Health Alliance, and what I recognized about them in our work is that we deepened our relationship because we see building connections between movements as key part of our power-based building pillar. So while planetary health is an interdisciplinary field that recognizes the interdependence of human health and the health of Earth's natural systems, WHEEL recognizes that the economic system is driving the decline in planetary and human health. This means we see a value in partnering with all other movements that look at climate, nature, and inequality, highlighting the driving force that is the economic system in the creation and perpetuation of these crises. Because without fixing the economic system, we won't achieve any of the outcomes that these movements care about too. Thank you.
Good. I want to make sure that I'm able to call on the 2 panelists who were on the screen, and that I know when you want to answer. So if you put your hand up, that would be great and helpful. And I open this now to all of our panelists. I mentioned during my opening comments that Rockefeller also gave a lot of visibility and a great deal of funding to the concept of resilience during our centennial year. And Pim's great slide already kind of linked resilience, sustainability, and planetary health. But I'd like to ask any speaker who wants to respond to the question, how do you see the relationship really between resilience and planetary health? And how does it factor into the work that you do? There are microphones. Andy? Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for that question. For me, when we talk about resilience, I always think about the community and basically link it to climate change and health adaptation strategies, for instance. And we see, like, for example, in Eastern Africa region, we are faced with a number of climate situations from flooding, drought, heat wave, and so on. But the way these communities are really trying to adapt to the situation is not really included mostly in research or publicized. So we see that there is need to really learn from the communities, how are they trying to be resilient during this situation. For example, I've been able to work with indigenous communities in Kenya, especially from the Lake Baringo, who are really affected by flooding and drought. And for them, if you talk to them about planetary health or climate change, some of them think that it's a curse from God that they're faced with this situation, while others already are aware about the situation and they're trying to cope. For example, when we talk about malaria, because some of them, they still don't use the medicine that are offered from pharmaceuticals. So for them, they say like, oh, because we are pastoralists, we can depend on the cow dung to smear on our skin so that we prevent ourselves from getting malaria, for example. And also when we talk about women and girls who are really, because for them, they also, it's a source of wealth for them to have big pieces of land, but now imagine a land that is really flooded and they have to be displaced. So for them now, they have to discuss more about reproductive health and do family planning amongst the girls. So this is something that they're really trying to push forward. So we need more support on this kind of situations, on how can they really be sustainable in this setting, because sometimes they also lack knowledge on how to do family planning or things like this. But thanks to community health workers who are really doing more of advocacy in this, and this is really critical. But for me, it's really sad sometimes to see that we as scientists, we don't really go back maybe to share our research findings or disseminate our research findings to them so that they can learn also from what we are trying to do in our scientific spaces. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I think there's one there. Oh. No? Okay.
Thank you for the question. And from my point of view, I believe that planetary health is a lens to promote and a lens to achieve resilience collectively in a community. So from my work with education, planetary health education and climate change and health impacts education, planetary health works as a way in planetary health collectively translated to concepts that normal people could understand. So in my work of education is how to put planetary health in words that outside the academia, outside the scientific groups, we could understand how climate change impacts my life. What is climate change in my daily basis, and how we can promote as a community the resilience that we need here. Because resilience will work for common people if they are involved in its promotion. So what I see is that education and this putting planetary health in daily lives is a way of achieving resilience in a collective manner.
Just one small brief point, and maybe a caution around the use of the word resilience, maybe from a justice perspective, is that we often hear, particularly with Indigenous youth, that they need to develop resilience, when it often puts the focus on the individual as instead of interrogating the structural changes that surround them, that enable the need for resistance. So I just wanted to add that because I think we often put resilience on people without, again, really interrogating those structural factors that create the situation that they're in need of being resilient to.
I'd like to double down on that and just say that resilience really means the social, the economic, as well as the environmental, and that it is a systems and community level rather than individual. You know, often when bad things happen, we talk about people doing well because we say they're resilient as if that's a personality trait that you either have or don't have. And it puts a lot of pressure, I think, on individuals when we really are talking about the systems level issues, when we're discussing the concept of resilience appropriately. Andy?
Yeah, just to add, obviously resilience is absolutely crucial because we're facing these unprecedented environmental threats. But I'm also concerned that we are damaging the resilience of the underlying natural systems as we move towards potentially over 3 degrees global average temperature increase, for example. Also combined with dramatic deforestation in some parts of the world. For example, we're seeing in the Amazon the fact that it's being transformed from a carbon sink into a source of carbon. So we need to combine resilience with mitigation. And we should consider it as an integrated concept. It's resilience and adaptation and mitigation. And we can't have one without the other, in my view.
I agree with that. Maisarah. Oh, we have both hands up. So Maisarah and then Michael.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to just build off of what Nicole said earlier. And when I think about resilience, I really think about people because it's, when we think about resilience in the form of just bouncing back to what things are and where it is now, that's not going to work because then nothing will really change. And so we really have to also acknowledge one of the challenges of that being institutional inertia of, you know, where things are in terms of short-term capitalism between, in terms of fragmented governance and how no matter what, solutions that we bring to the table, if this is not fixed structurally and then not reformed fundamentally, then we might just face the same problem. But what I mean also about resilience of the people is, for all of us in the Planetary Health community and beyond, and especially maybe speaking in the context of youth, when, so much of the news that you see on the daily are so negative and so depressing, how do we also build that resilience for people's, characters to stay on track with the agendas that they have, to stay on track with, pushing for a healthy planet and making sure that silos are broken, making sure that this institutional inertia and all of the fragmented governance actually gets addressed. So maybe that's a perspective that is worth looking at too.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, no, just to add really, when I think about resilience, what I think about, and when I describe it in an economic sense, is power concentrations. A more resilient system is one where power is more equally shared. Relationships are not transactional, they are genuinely relational between different actors in an economy. And I think it's a good mirror to planetary health and the way nature actually behaves. You don't have one concentrated power, source of power, if you like, and control. You actually have that distributed. So that's the way that we always look to try and sort of connect that term in and bring it back to the power imbalances, which are so evident in the economic system at the moment.
Thanks. I'm sure we have loads of questions from the audience, so I will stop. I will end, though, just to warn the panelists, with a literally 1 minute each lightning round on where you see the greatest opportunity for planetary health going forward from your perspective, the single greatest. There are many, many. Questions?
Yes. Okay, this is on. I just want to quickly acknowledge that we are seeing a lot of questions come in about AI. And there is a parallel session Thursday afternoon about AI. So I think those questions might be better suited for that panel. But with that said, I want to ask the first question here. What is the role of feminism, including feminist economics, in planetary health movement, especially given the current state of manosphere and ongoing exasperating global inequality?
Sorry.
Yep, it's an interesting question, and I think from an Indigenous perspective, the feminist movement has not been very intersectional in terms of the inclusion of Indigenous voices. So, you know, not to disparage, of course, the movement itself, but there's been a lot of criticism from Indigenous, you know, feminist sort of perspective, or what may be, you know, termed as our rematriation process of bringing that feminine aspect back. So I can speak from that perspective, and obviously we've seen from many Indigenous dialogues on the importance of women's leadership as part of that process, and really embedding it as a structural component. Because I think when it's, as soon as you have a field, you know, people kind of separate it, you know, feminists talk over there, as opposed to integrated. It's a responsibility across all fields and disciplines. It shouldn't just be feminist movements, it should be everybody. It should be men. You know, men have a large role in this, and we often don't talk about men's roles, I think, in terms of the rematriation and the upbringing, and really taking a step back to allow women leadership to come forward. And we see great examples of that coming, you know, in our schools and institutions, but particularly with our young boys as well. There's a lot of concerning movement, of course, with the social media and the exposures to young boys on these concepts that are coming forward. And I think, to be honest, that's one of our biggest risks we have right now, is being able to think more collectively as a public health community on combating some of those movements around anti-women that are stemming from various circles on social media platforms. So feminism, one side, but again, rematriation across disciplines, across policy movements, it needs to be a responsibility for everyone.
That's critical. Next question.
The next question here is about reframing security. How would you do that? Right now, people feel that not buying more weapons would be destructive.
Well, of course, it's not easy to reframe security, because the dominant mode of thinking about security is around weapons and armaments. But the problem with that mode of thinking is that ultimately it undermines our potential security both by depriving us of essential resources which should be spent on other things, but also by reinforcing the concept of the enemy. And if you demonize the enemy, of course, then you can do anything to the enemy. And you can also justify almost unlimited expenditure because you're dealing with some demonic force. But what we're dealing with here is humans and human political systems, which we may disagree with profoundly. But, you know, the people you have to negotiate with are your adversaries. You don't need to negotiate with your friends very much, hopefully. But you do need to negotiate with your adversaries. And you need to understand what their goals are. What are your lines that you're not prepared to move beyond? So I think we do need to rekindle this idea of negotiation more, and you don't have to agree on everything before you start negotiation. I was involved quite a lot during the Cold War in something called the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and that was a very interesting experience because we were essentially told that the Soviet citizens were being told that they could survive nuclear war. And so they were going to attack us because they believed that they could survive. So one way we tried to get around that was actually going to the then Soviet Union and talking in public meetings about nuclear weapons and nuclear war and saying, you're not going to survive nuclear war by civil defense. You know, it isn't going to work like that. And so we tried to ensure that we were giving similar messages to both kind of publics. That may be more difficult now because the polarization is very, very intense. But I do think we need to try and build that dialogue, and maybe that's where the scientific community has a role. Because sometimes we have links that other people don't, and we can depoliticize it and reduce the emotional temperature and talk to our scientific colleagues about what some of the real issues are. So it won't be easy, there's no simple answer to that, but in the end you have to negotiate.
Maisarah?
Yeah, I think there are several entry points to bringing in planetary health in the security realm. As it is, there's already the whole discourse on non-traditional security and more so on, climate, peace and security. So there are already areas that people are looking into, even among security practitioners themselves. But I think also just even reframing our own understanding of security beyond, military strength, which is the whole traditional security aspect. I can share, for example, in ASEAN, security is not necessarily just understood in the form of military strength in the arms, but actually more so in safety, in well-being, and partly because maybe of a cultural context that we have here. Because if you translate security in, for example, in Malay, it's keselamatan, it's safety directly translated. So there are already pockets of people who are pushing for conversations of human security that transcends beyond just military and weapons. But I think also that's really an opportunity for us in the sense of in making sure that the language that we are communicating to different people, different stakeholders, and different just groups of people and communities are ways that they're able to resonate with and they're able to understand. And seeing that, just have to kind of remark earlier that there was a lot of questions on AI. I think it's really interesting and it needs to be talked about as well, because if this is something that a lot of energy and investments are going into, and I can say for sure in Malaysia and in ASEAN, everybody's talking about it as like the sexiest new thing on the block. So we as a community need to be able to find ways and find entry points where we can reframe planetary health in a way that is palatable for them, but also using those platforms to build planetary health even further.
Thank you. I also want to note that there is a session Wednesday afternoon about planetary health, peace, and security to continue this conversation there. This next question is directed to Dr. Redvers. What would you like all Western medical students to be taught about Mother Earth and planetary health?
Yes, Dean. So that's a great question, and I want to point to the leadership of the Associations of Faculties of Medicine of Canada, which is made up of the 18 medical school deans across Canada. And they created a academic declaration on planetary health back in April 2023 that was signed on by 17 of the 18 medical schools. One had a little bit of a hiccup around fossil fuel issues because they couldn't make decisions on the board of directors, but that's a different point. And part of that process was ensuring the platforming of Indigenous peoples and their knowledges as part of cross-curriculum development. We do have a leg up, of course, in places where there are presence of Indigenous peoples to be able to ensure respectful and appropriate integration. It becomes more challenging sometimes in areas in other countries, of course, where the presence, namely Europe, of course, outside of Sami peoples, a little bit more north of us, and how to be able to respectfully include those components. However, there's enough resources, there's enough curriculum developed now happening in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, and New Zealand, and competency elements that have already been written out that are easily accessible on the web that can be modeled after with curriculum endpoints included for learning objectives as well, and wanting to call out many of the Indigenous colleagues that have helped to co-develop those across medical schools in those places, and would really encourage other countries to look to those curriculum points and objectives to be able to see how those might be modeled. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. I think by utilizing those components across schools, hopefully in many places we'll see some consistency in what many Indigenous communities see as the baseline level of knowledge that could be important for medical schools around the world, not only for the concepts of our own health and well-being and how we see our balance within the world, but how we relate to it through the earth as well. So AFMC website has some directives on that, but also happy to point people to that if they have specific queries.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Those are all the questions. I think we'll turn it back to you.
Okay, wonderful. Then I'm going to the lightning round, and I will start with Maisarah.
Thanks, Judith.
The greatest opportunity from your perspective.
Well, there's so many, but I think the biggest one is telling more stories and telling different kinds of stories. We have so many news now that's quite negative and doom and gloom, as I said, but I think we really need to reframe the whole planetary crisis as an immediate human well-being solution. So moving the narrative from just distant threats to something that's more tangible and personal. And also highlighting more solutions and existing solutions that we have all around the world. I think we need more of those, and so that people can feel like it's not something that's so far ahead.
Great, thank you, Michael.
I'm going to go with a couple actually, and one is it sounds slightly negative, but bear with me here as a starting point, and that is that the current economic system has really given us the opportunity, I think, in the perversely, it's locked so many out of leading a fulfilling life that they've actually got no skin in the game. So they are not invested in the current economic system. They will push for a new economic system. So I think that's a real tremendous opportunity. But the positive one I'm going to go with is, I think, if we can make our messages more aligned so that decision makers don't think, oh, we've got everything from the Wellbeing Economy to Planetary Health Alliance to anything in between. Oh, no, actually, these things are all the same because they're actually using aligned messages. I think that's tremendously powerful.
Great, thank you. Tatiana, I'm going in reverse order to the speakers.
For me, I believe that planetary health could give us a way of advocating and conducting the movement of adaptation, especially for Latin America and especially for Brazil. Now we are much involved with the imminence of the COP30, which is said as the COP30 of adaptation. And I believe that planetary health could give us the concept and the fundamentals that adaptation is not just a question of infrastructure, of high tech, but we need to worry about social technologies, about life, about communities and communities technologies, ancient technologies. So I believe that planetary health could put this together in this movement for adaptation that it's so needed now, together with mitigation, echoing what Andy said, but I feel that the movement of adaptation is being pushed and planetary health could contribute.
Thank you. Elvine?
Thank you so much. In my opinion, I feel like there is need for systemic change in planetary health education across all disciplines. And at the moment, we have really wonderful resources that we've developed that we could use. And maybe in the next 10 years, if, let's say, 80% of all universities across the globe are integrating this planetary health, it will be easier for an individual to figure out if I want to contribute to planetary health to make it a better place on a macro level or on a meso level or micro level, depending on where you are involved in your career path and so on. Thank you.
Nicole?
Yeah, always hard to think of one, I think, from a holistic perspective, but just maybe bridging off a point that Andy made about the improvements in attribution and detection that have occurred in the climate change and health space. And what it really speaks to is we've been talking conceptually a lot in planetary health over the last 10 years. You know, we need to do this, we need to do this, but actually getting down to the nitty-gritty, methodologies for how to be able to work in transdisciplinary circles. We need to stop talking about it, but actually bridge discipline, define new methodologies to be able to work through those things, which I think is a huge opportunity for this space because it requires it to be successful. It requires it for lawsuits. It also requires it to be looking at transdisciplinarity, not just from a field standpoint, from a knowledge to knowledge standpoint. So knowledge translation between indigenous systems and Euro-Western systems, but also between community-based knowledges and scientific knowledges as well. So again, this idea of system-based approaches, rethinking methodologies, and actually going to knock on your, separate disciplines' doors and think through new ways to bridge these things together.
Andy?
Thanks. Well, I agree very much about the climate litigation. I think this is a potential opportunity. But let me make a slightly different point, which is I think for the next few years, where we have national governments that may be retreating from some of the earlier commitments, we need to focus very much on working with local governments, city governments, where you do find a lot more understanding of how the environment links to human health and well-being more generally in the population. And also maybe slightly less susceptible to populist waves, because mayors and other civic leaders have to deliver. They have to deliver local services. If they don't do that, they'll get thrown out. So they have to be pragmatic people. And we find that there is an openness, more of an openness to some of these ideas at the level of the local government and cities. And that's particularly important, not just in established economies, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, where many of the cities of the future are being built. And I think those emerging leaders really are going to be potentially very important to interact with, to really try to develop cities in a different way than the resource-intensive, energy-hungry cities that we have in the global north. Thank you.
I would add to that, as a final point, that by the year 2050, we'll have about 30 new cities that have huge, huge populations, and that much of the infrastructure, both social but also actual infrastructure, will be built in East and Southeast Asia and in Africa. And how we build this concept of planetary health into the new infrastructures that will really determine all of our futures, I think is an opportunity that I hope that the field really embraces and undertakes. With that, I'd like to thank our amazing panel. I hope you'll join me.
And I will add my thanks to this panel. One of the things that this panel represents, which is so inherent in planetary health, is there are so many different lenses that we need to take to one common topic, and this was a great demonstration of that today, so thank you very much. I'm going to ask our speakers to stay on stage for pictures while I make some very important announcements about a topic that is critical, which is lunch. So first of all, I'm Jessica Kronstadt. I'm the program director at the Planetary Health Alliance, and I want to welcome you all here.